Yes, welcome at the Zuid-Afrikahuis in Amsterdam. Welcome to the people here in the room and also to the people joining us online. My name is Vincent Kuitenbrouwer and I work as a historian at the University of Amsterdam, and I'm also a member of the board of the Zuid-Afrikahuis, the stichting. Today we are discussing a book that was published by Brill in 2022, last year, that discusses history that is directly related to this institution, also to the collections that are held here. The title of that book is Brother Nation or Lost Colony: The Dutch Rediscover the Dutch Africans, 1847 to 1900, and it was written by Andrew Burnett. Burnett was born in South Africa and educated there and in the UK, and he has worked as a lawyer in South Africa and in Australia. He read modern history at the University of Oxford, and in 2020 completed a PhD at the University of the Western Australia in Perth. His academic interests focus on white settler nationalism, and he has previously written and published on the impact of the South African War on Australian identity. For the book we discussed today, Burnett made extensive use of the historical library that is kept here in this institution, particularly that collection of the Nederlands-Zuid-Afrikaanse Vereniging, the Dutch South African Society. And that collection includes many pamphlets and other publication that allows historians today to reflect on the interest of Dutch pundits in their so-called kinsmen in South Africa in the second half of the 19th century. And I think, as such, the book shows the riches of the collection of Zuid-Afrikahuis, and it's therefore quite nice that we are able to discuss it here in this place. Today, Burnett will give a talk about this book, which is followed by some comments from some people who are present. The first commentator is Jacob Boersema, who works as a lecturer at the sociology department of New York University. His academic work focuses on white nationalism and the new right, and he's a regular contributor to various media outlets on these topics. The second commentator will be Barbara Henkes, an historian affiliated to the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen, and her academic work focuses on the history of migration, including those of Dutch immigrants who went to South Africa in the 1950s. And her latest book was published by Brill in 2020, Negotiating Racial Politics in the Family, Transnational Histories Touched by National Socialism and Apartheid. So I will start off by giving the word to Andrew.
Goedenavond en bedankt Vincent voor de introductie en bedankt allemaal voor jullie aanwezigheid. Mijn boek beschrijft de hoop en dromen van enkele leden van de intellectuele en culturele elites in Nederland in die tweede helft van de 19e eeuw. In die komende 15 minuten zal ik enkele aspecten van hun verhaal belichten. Ik betoog na Ernst Renan dat een nasie bestaat uit personen die geloven dat zij deel uitmaken van een gemeenschap met andere personen, gebaseerd op het gemeenschappelijke bezit van een rijke erfenis van herinnering en huidige acceptatie. 100 jaar later ontwikkelde Benedict Anderson de definitie van Renan en schreef dat nasie en soevereine gemeenschap beschreef niet noodzakelijk gebaseerd op etniciteit. Omdat het idee was in die hoofden van elk lid van die nasie die zich hun gemeenschap voorstelde met hun mede-onderdanen. Mijn verhaal en het bewijs waarop het is gebaseerd, laten zien dat hun definitie het beste verklaart waarin die Hollandse Afrikanen in het land waarin zij woonden geen broedernasie, maar eerder een verloren kolonie verteenwoordigden. Het is dus niet de definitie van nasie waar de Nederlandse voorstanders van stamverwantschap voor pleiten. Zij geloofden dat die afdaling, dat wil zeggen de bloedlijn, ras en taal, de uitwisbare kenmerken van de nasie waren. En het was mogelijk om een nasie te beschouwen als iets dat altyd in een of andere vorm heeft bestaan. Als zij de sociale aspekten van stamverwantschap belangrijk hadden gevonden, hadden de stamverwantschap-ideologen zich misschien gerealiseerd dat het creëren van een nationale identiteit op basis van etniciteit, taal en religie, zonder bewijs van duurzame sociale banden, gedeelde herinneringen of een wederzijds ontwikkeld nationale bewustzijn geen basis was voor een bredere en stabiele Nederlandse nationale identiteit. I want to look now at two definitions, further definitions. Stamverwantschap or kinship was all about cultural nationalism. This concept or term explains the behavior of individuals and groups who believe themselves to be a nation, such as the Basques in Spain, or many people throughout the world who self-identify as indigenous peoples, despite the absence of their own sovereign nation-state. It is on this basis that the efforts of the Dutch kinship movement may be characterized as the pursuit of a constructed cultural nationalism based on the concept of Dutchness, without achieving sovereign political identity. A colony, I suggest, is an area under the full or partial control of another nation-state empire or chartered company, such as the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. This may be occupied by settlers from the mother state, or it may be a franchise colony in which the indigenous people are governed from the mother state. Inherent in this definition is the existence of a mother state or metropole, in this case the Netherlands, given that colony and metropole can only be understood in relation to each other. Although the VOC had been a company rather than a nation-state, the extensive terms of its charter, which included employing its own armed forces and its own clergymen and church arrangements, made it a colonizing force at the Cape and representative of a mother state, the United Provinces. A colony can also, in relation to the mother state, be described as a bridgehead for the injection of metropolitan power and the conduit for the mother state's influence in the wider geographical region. I argue that the kinship movement was a vehicle for the imposition of a Dutch national identity on the people they called Dutch Africans. These Dutch Africans were the descendants of French Huguenots, of the Khoi, of VOC officials and employees, and of slaves transported by the Dutch principally from Indonesia. The Dutch kinship movement founded on the rock of colonial nationalism in southern Africa because the consciousness of the Dutch Africans had been molded by their own circumstances into a national identity based on a colonial nationalism or settler nationalism of the native born, who celebrated their roots in Africa and on memories not shared with their metropolitan cousins in the Netherlands. As a result, the Dutch Africans identified themselves as indigenous over against the European Dutch. Accordingly, they declined when it was offered to them in the mid and late 19th century the benefits of Dutchness. They declined it. Voor die Verenigde Provincies waren in die jaren 1795 tot 1813 een periode van aanzienlijke ontwrichting. Een gevolg van deze ingrypende veranderingen was dat sommige Nederlanders vanaf die jaren 1840 terugkijken naar hun gouden eeuw in de 17e eeuw als basis voor een verhaal op hun nuwe identiteit te creëren. In dit proces ontdekten zij de Hollandse Afrikanen. De wortels van stamverwantschap als ideologie zijn te vinden in dit opkomende moderne Nederland en zijn zoektocht naar een plaats in een post-Napoleontisch Europa. De rode draad door het verhaal is die ideologie om de Hollandse Afrikanen te transformeren in Nederlanders en Zuid-Afrika tot een tweede Nederland. Door Nederlandse en Afrikaanse bronnen opnieuw te verbinden, heb ik geprobeerd grenzen te verleggen om een nieuwe kijk op de Nederlanders en hulle koloniale geschiedenis te creëren. I now want to show you some pictures quickly which give you the two views. The second, the British, there's the Dutch. That's the Dutch looking at Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, Oranje Vrystaat, Stellaland. There was also another republic called Goshen. There was the Republic of Natalia, but that was earlier in the 1840s, and there was Vryheid. And now look at the British. The Union Jack is everywhere, except Transvaal and Oranje Vrystaat. This book demonstrates, Oranje Vrystaat. In the 15 minutes, I cannot provide detail about all matters in the book, and this is a quick view of some of those which I do not discuss, but which are some of them controversial, and some of them simply interesting for historians. Slavery, Dutch migration, which Professor Henkers has written about, capital raising in the Netherlands for the construction of railways, including the Dutch assessment of sovereign risk and their failure to put the money where their mouth was. The kinship movement's inspiration of Dutch poets and novelists. The NZRV, which Vincent spoke about. The Jonkman report on a visit to South Africa. And the debate about which writing in Dutch can be accepted as part of the Afrikaans canon, and therefore a part of Afrikaner national identity, and which writing should not be accepted. Siegfried Huygens, writing currently, his more inclusive approach is something I support because it supports the connection of Dutch and Afrikaans. Conor Meyer, who is an authoritative author on the subject, Afrikaans, South African, reflects the reality, however, of competing national identities and confirms the failure of the Dutch kinship movement to create a cultural unity based on language. Three themes which I would like to discuss are the fact that I'm bringing together Afrikaans and Dutch sources, which it doesn't always happen, that the Dutch kinship movement began earlier than many historians recognized, not in 1881, but in the late 1840s. And from the many leading Dutch intellectuals which I've mentioned in the book, I've chosen to highlight the work of Nicolaas Mansveld and Abram Kuyper. So the book demonstrates the importance of connecting Dutch and South African historiography, which had for the most part of the 20th century operated in isolation. I suggest this disconnect is because the history of the Dutch metropole and its colonies, in which I include the proto-colonial possession of the Dutch metropole, the colonial possession of the Cape by the VOC, became detached after decolonization. Added to this process of decoupling was the justifiable revulsion which the Dutch felt after 1960 for the apartheid state. Art Bevinger, whose book De Kaap de Goede Hoop, een Nederlandse vestingskolonie, was published in Amsterdam in 1999, suggested that when he commenced his research, South Africa was for the Dutch still a source of shame, an anachronism where their overseas kin had on a large scale breached the moral code of the post-war and post-colonial world. Ulrich Laut's herontdekking begon in the jaren 1840. He was born in 1787. He taught Dutch language and literature. He was a professor. He wrote 17 books, published 4 of which centered on the Dutch in Southern Africa, including a general history of the Cape. Interesting, Algemeen Handelsblad's reviewer wrote of this work, of all the colonies which we have lost over time, there is none which has maintained so many relationships with our country as the Cape of Good Hope. His further books included a second work on the Dutch at the Cape, a biography of Andries Pretorius, one of the immigrant leaders, and a call to the Dutch to support the Dutch African colonists north of the Vaal River. His most important work, for my purposes, is entitled De Kaapse Landverhuizers, and it received good reviews and wide coverage in the Dutch press in 1847. Hence, the 1847 in the title of my book. He characterized the Dutch-speaking farmers who had emigrated from the eastern districts of the Cape Colony in the late 1830s as stamgenoten, or kinsmen, brave Protestant pioneers who shared their religion and their language with the old motherland. Like the Israelites, they endured hardship, trusting in God as they traveled in search of their new fatherland. These kinsmen, he said, had formed a nation and tamed the wilderness to build their new fatherland. But they needed pastors, teachers, doctors, veterinarians, and tradesmen of all kinds from the Netherlands. In one of in his use of imagery and his creation of the Dutch African immigrants as symbols of Dutchness to be emulated by the Netherlanders back home, he laid the foundation for the belief that the Dutch Africans were a brother nation, which ran like a thread through later Dutch writing about the Stamverwanten. It was Louts who contracted the founder of the Nederlandse Hervormde Kerk in Southern Africa, which is different to what you would call that NHK here. His name was Dirk van Hof. He traveled to Transvaal in 1852, and he was really the rock on which that church, Transvaal Church, was built. He also participated in commercial ventures, and he sent teachers and veterinarian and teachers to the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. He even persuaded in 1853 the member of the lower house for Zwolle, Bartholomeus Sloot tot Oldhuis, to ask the Minister for Foreign Affairs when the Dutch government would recognize the Dutch Republic on the Vaal River in the wilderness of Africa. The phrase used by the minister by the member for Zwolle in the Dutch lower house echoed Louts's rhetoric. One of which I mentioned, he mentioned the struggle of our former kinsmen against mighty England and equally against the many tribes in Africa makes us remember the perseverance of our forefathers in the struggle against Spain. So back to the Golden Age. In his response, the minister said it was a tonic for our national pride to see that the descendants of our forefathers have developed such spirit. Betekenis van Louts. Professor Louts was, zoals veel volgende verwantschap-liefhebbers, een academicus die nooit naar Zuidelijk Afrika zou reizen. Zijn werk uit 1847 over de emigratie van Nederlandse boeren uit die Kaapkolonie was 10 jaar in de maak. Hy was bereid de stamverwanten te verdedigen teen kritiek van alle kanten. Dit omvatte de Nederlandse missionaire vereniging, waarvan de geskriften het gedrag van die Transvaalboeren jegens die autochtone inwoners herhaaldelijk beschreven als onrechtvaardig en wreed. In zijn reactie op Groen van Prinsterer vertelde Louts die lezers van Algemeen Handelsblad dat deze rapporten gebaseerd waren op die leugens van Franse en Engelse missionarissen. Die 20ste eeuwse Afrikaner nationalistische beweging zou Louts roemen als de man de stemmen hoorde roepen vanuit het zuiden en voor het eerst in het Nederlands schreef over de Kaapse immigranten. Het beschrijven van de fundamentele gebeurtenis van de Afrikaner nationale identiteit, de grote trek. Jaren na zijn dood verkocht Louts dochter zijn documenten. Het grootste deel is gekocht door de Zuid-Afrikaanse regering en vormt de Louts collectie in Pretoria. Een kleinere collectie wordt beheerd door de Universiteit Leiden. Gezien die locatie, zijn slechte reputatie onder Nederlandse tijdgenoten en dat zijn nalatenschap werd toegeëigend door Afrikaner nationalisme, is het niet verwonderlijk dat de rol dat hij speelde in de pro-boerenbeweging in Nederland in de jaren 1840 en 1850 geen aandacht heeft gekregen in de moderne Nederlandse geschiedschrijving over stamverwantschap. Hy was een belangrike figuur. Now turn to Abram Kuiper, who will be no stranger to you. The Dutch Working Men's Association was celebrating the visit by the Transvaalers 3 years after they had won the First Freedom War in 1881 with the last battle at Majuba. Patrimonium, this association, entertained the Transvaalers at Plankius on 11 March. Kuiper's Plankius speech, as head obviously of the Neo-Calvinists, with its emphasis on the Dutch Africans, is a clear exposition of the European drive to expand in the late 19th century. He acknowledged the ties of blood formed the foundation of the relationship, but he suggested that those in the Patrimonian reception dank, ja, I must find it. That oh no, it doesn't. We seem to be missing one. I will need your assistance. It is it. Thank you all. That's great. Um, he suggested that in the Patrimonium reception, because these are neo-Calvinists, they spoke from the heart of a closer relationship. He explained that as a result of the ties of belief, there moved between those present a feeling that is higher and more holy. Time does not permit too much detail about Kuiper's talk at Patrimonium, so I'm going to move fast through it. However, he said that the difference between the war in Aceh, which was going on at the time in Indonesia, and the war fought by the Boeren or the Dutch Africans, he felt that the Netherland people were found more important the Transvaalers' victories, because for Kuiper, national identity depended on blood ties, language, and religion, not ruling over distant Asian communities, however profitable they were. He was not pleased with the modern Netherlands for him. He saw the new, young, united Netherlands in the south, which was his vision. He said, we here are a nation divided, Dutch son against Dutch son, between those who would pass by Jesus and those who would love his name. But he suggested that if the Netherlands were attacked and overwhelmed by Germany, then our people would go over the sea and migrate to the Transvaal. He didn't only say that once, he said it twice. He said, if the liberals chase us out of the Netherlands, then the core of our Christian people will also cross the sea to the Transvaal. He gave a purpose and identity for the Dutch Africans who were present, the Transvaalers. And he told them, by mistake in one way, he said, you have a very good policy towards the indigenous people in your country, because you will eventually, but only eventually, not like the British, you will eventually bring them to the same status as yourselves. He must have forgotten that in the Transvaal constitution it said, "Daar sal nooit gelykskelling wees. Never will there be equality." So I don't know what Kruger and his team made of that. Mansveld, he was I would characterize him as a culture warrior. He went to South Africa in 1874 as a young school teacher at the gymnasium in Stellenbosch. He identified that there were three different groups of people that he was dealing with there. He argued that Dutch was the mother tongue of the Cape Dutch. The fact that he wasn't correct was actually borne out in subsequent years, but at the time he made a convincing argument. There was in South Africa S.J. de Tooy, who was an Afrikaner linguist and nationalist who created the GRA, Genootskap van Regte Afrikaners. And there was a tussle always between, for Mansveld, between the Dutch Africans with English hearts, those with Afrikaner hearts, and those with Dutch hearts. He became superintendent in Kruger ZAR in 1891, and there he really built up the department to something significant. And one of his factors, one of his features, was that he insisted that his teachers would be able to speak and write Dutch. So overall, and I must rush this, he confirms his status as a cultural warrior. But not only did he have the British to contend with, but also two groups of Dutch Africans who were ambivalent about Dutch. These were the Dutch Africans with English hearts, who didn't like the sophisticated Dutch grammar, the Afrikanerized Dutch Africans under Du Toit, who reacted to British cultural imperialism by in a different method. They said they have their own mother tongue. It's called Die Taal, and it's not Dutch. It was in his relationship with the Afrikanerized Dutch Africans, not in the more obvious Dutch English group, that the real material for his role can be found. He did, in fact, a great job. He was an important brick in the wall which the Cape Dutch had built to withstand Anglicization. And it was in no small no small measure due to him, that the Cape Dutch were with some confidence be able to believe that their heritage included a language which could survive in the world beyond the kitchen. I'll bring you some conclusions very quickly. In the final 2 decades of the 19th century, the more assertive approach from the NZRV and the kinship movement supported a cultural imperialism, which saw the kinship movement become the justification for the export of Dutch language and culture to their kinsmen as a good thing in itself and as a counter to British cultural imperialism. I will leave you with this thought. My book argues that the additional reasons for the failure were the risk-averse assessments of sovereign risk in the Dutch bridgeheads, the fact that the Dutch were migrating for a better life. They weren't drawn to go to serve Dutch foreign policy by moving to southern Africa. Further, there was the absolute commitment of successive Dutch governments to neutrality policy that avoided any Dutch actions at government level. So, for those who dreamed the great dream, the loss of their bridgeheads made the failure of the kinship movement very painful for its proponents, because it meant that they were truly lost colonies. It had been a magnificent dream while it lasted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful presentation and some glimpses from your book because you didn't discuss it all. By the way, I think Brill left some forms here in the room, so if you want to order a copy, you can do that via that form, and the people online, I think there's a URL in the screen or on the PowerPoint, which you can use to access the websites of the publisher. Right. As announced, we will have a discussion, which is kicked off by two commentators, and I would like to ask Jacob to give the first kickoff.
Does this work? Yeah, fine. Well, thank you very much for your wonderful book. I truly enjoyed reading it, Brother Nation or Lost Colony. Um, Let me start with just two things about where my questions are coming from. So I'm not an historian; I'm a sociologist. Although I also have a master in history, so technically I'm a sociologist and historian. And my work has been mainly the last couple of years on race and racism. Um, I wrote a book about white South Africans. It's a sociological study, which I also presented here in the house half a year ago. But currently, I'm really working on the history of what I call the history of Dutch racism. So I was truly amazed by your book because I was reading about this guy we know quite well in the Netherlands, Abraham Kuyper. And it's also my family background. My grandfather was a minister, a huge fan of Abraham Kuyper, even more of Bavink, his colleague, his theologian. Groen van Pinstere, he wrote books about him. So it's very much the world I'm coming from. And I started studying Abraham Kuyper, and you might have read his book, or it was a speech, of course, that then made into a book, which sort of got me onto this topic. What's it? South Africa in Crisis, his famous book from 1900, right? Where he's quite explicit, right, about his racial language, about his seeing the threat of race of black people in South Africa, and sort of that got me thinking about um, um, what's the role of race in this story that you're telling in your book. So let me start with the most pressing issue, I think. And you started with your slide. Slavery is not central in your book so much. Also not in the presentation, but I think you actually have a lot to say in the book about it. So my first question is, and your book is really wonderful, and it combines Dutch history and South African history. I think that's really innovative, and the way you use sources. So as I was thinking, from the Dutch perspective, I was thinking, we're this year we're celebrating the apology. We're not celebrating. We're thinking about it. We're studying it. We're wrestling with it, trying to reckon with it. And the South African story is quite interesting because it sort of starts off as we just abolished or tried to abolish or in the process of abolishing slavery in the other colonies.
Mhm.
So I was really curious what you thought about sort of the thoughts about slavery of the Dutch for the African. Like if you make it specific about Abraham Kuyper, he's an apologist, right, for slavery, and they accuse the English. But I was really curious what you thought. Um, my second question is what you clearly explained in your presentation, also for those that didn't have the privilege of reading your book, this idea of stamverwantschap, and you define it as bloodline, ras, and taal. Those are three very interesting words, I think, that I want you to reflect a little bit more on. I love to hear what you think. What of the three are the most important? How do they play a role? So those two questions I had as an opening, and then there are many more, of course. But thank you for your book. Yeah.
For the kind thing you've said and also your questions. Thank you for the kind things you've said and also for your questions. On the issue of slavery, I would clarify then the British abolished it 1828, the Dutch sometime in the 1860s in their colonies. However, what is important in the context of my book is that in 1852 and 1854, when the British allowed the Dutch republics their own self government, they made it clear that they could not have slavery. And that became a reason why they invaded Transvaal in 1880 and again argued in 1899 that this was another justification for war. However, it was more important, I think, in 1880. The issue I would like to mention is that the evidence suggests that indentured contracts of indenture were in fact, and I don't know the Dutch word for indentured contracts, but they compelled vendor children who were captured in raids across the border by the Dutch farmers or the Dutch African farmers. They were compelled then to work for a master until they were 25 years of old. It was this that is the real slavery, and it is slavery. But it is not exactly the same as the slavery that was abolished by the British in 1828. But it is a central issue. And what your point about Abram Kuiper and others is that they, first of all, were long ago, Veth and other intellectuals were infatuated with English liberalism. But as soon as this stamverwantschap issue came into focus, they were against whatever the British liberals said and included the attack on slavery. So they justified it, to be frank. Your second issue was bloodline, race, and religion. Bloodline, language and religion.
Language, religion. Yes.
To me, the most relevant issue now for us is Ukraine and Russia, because that is the justification in Mr. Putin's mind for attacking Ukraine. They are the same as us. They are our people. Renan and Benedict Anderson's view about what is a nation is completely different. And it is what is in the heads of the people, in their imaginations and in their understanding and in their commitments and their contract between each other. So I can only say that the kinship people were completely wrong, and it was proven to be wrong. In brief.
Yeah.
I think is that good for now, and maybe you can revisit some of these points, and also maybe talk about like the implications this kind of studies has for the wider debate on Dutch colonialism. But first, I would like to invite Barbara to share some views with us.
Yes. Well, thank you, Andrew, for your introduction and your book, of course. And thanks also for Jamie for the opportunity to discuss with the others. Andrew's book shows the passion with which he threw himself into the archives, finding new details about Dutch South African intertwinements. And as you all probably know, the Zuid-Afrikahuis feels drawn in the current discussion on Dutch colonial past and the place het huis occupies in this as a post-colonial institution. For this occasion, I would like to ask you a more general question about your book as it is published in the series European Expansion and Indigenous Response. So in the editor's preface, George Brian Souza, do I pronounce it well? Okay, from the University of Texas, writes, and I quote, that the series' founding objectives are to focus on publications that understand and deal with the processes of European expansion, interchange, and connectivity in a global context in the early modern and modern period. And moreover, the series aims to provide a forum for scholarly work, and I quote once more, that moves beyond the traditional isolated and nation-bound historiographical emphasis of the field, encouraging, whenever possible, non-European perspectives. So, if a non-European perspective forms the starting point for the series, I wondered how your book fits in. And apparently, the editor-in-chief is aware of the controversy around this point when he introduces your book very kindly and enthusiastic, but he remarks the degree that Transvaal Boer's response may be characterized as indigenous is controversial, polemical, and subject to debate and may even be discarded. So I thought we are having a debate. So I would love to know from you, because I missed your position on this issue. So I would love to challenge you to say a bit more about how your book looks at the indigenousness, yes, of the so-called Dutch Africans.
Yes. Yes. That is a very good question. And I think, in part, to be quite frank, the thesis for which I achieved my PhD had less emphasis on what the ultimate manuscript for the book dealt with, because when the editor read my thesis, he said, "I want this for my series." So I worked, and I felt it was justified to say that, in the context of what I've discussed with Jacob on the definition of a nation, that it was possible to argue, and it is only an argument, it is possible to argue that because the Dutch Africans, as we'll call them for the moment, they became, obviously, under the Afrikaner national state, white Dutch Africans, but because in the 18th and 19th century they hadn't achieved that yet, they believed they were indigenous, many of them, and some of their writings confirm that. And so, in that respect, and in the modern use of the word indigenous, which allows one to say, I am indigenous if I identify as indigenous, I felt it was permissible to argue that their response to the Dutchness that they were offered by Mansveld and others was an indigenous response. And so I think, in my discussions with my editor, I think he felt that was arguable. I cannot give a better short explanation than to say also that, let me just say also that the issue I alluded to briefly of the Afrikaans literary canon is a case in point where there was a rejection of Dutch writing by the Afrikaans literary group, who said that, intellectuals who said, no, that's not Afrikaans. And so, and again, that is, in my view, an indigenous response. They were not black people, they were white people, but they were indigenous. They thought they were indigenous. They argued they were indigenous.
May I react?
Sure. Yeah.
It struck me in your introduction as well that you said they saw themselves as indigenous, and I'm sure they did. However, you are a historian, so you, I think it's important as historians to reflect on, if we take the identifications of our historical subjects like they present them, or if you try to analyze why they present themselves as such, and wonder, what do I think about this idea of indigenousness? What do I think about their presentation, their identification in that way? And how do I relate that to the people who lived in that country before they came and occupied it? So that's what I wonder, this distance between the historical subjects and the historian.
Very good question. All I can say is that in the modern world, where people identify as indigenous, it is accepted that they identify themselves as indigenous. And I think that is a reasonable argument to make. Your point is, well, what about the distance of the past? I think we have to take account of that. But that's all I can say. I mean, your point is a valid one, in the sense that before the VOC colonized the Cape, the Khoi were there, and they were dispossessed. and
Well,
made into an underclass.
maybe we can. I think this is also a little bit about like the nature of Afrikaner nationalism as a form of colonialism, maybe. So how would you respond to that? Is this term indigenousness? Does that mean that the Afrikaners are like? How do you see the Transvaal and the Orange Free State as projects? Would you see that those as African states or more like European states or European styled states in Africa, and therefore comparable to the Cape Colony or Natal under British rule?
There's no doubt that in 1850, or 1852, 1854, those two Dutch states had constitutions which were drawn up. One of them was drawn up by Jacobus Stewart, who was a Dutchman in South Africa. They saw themselves as using European legal concepts such as constitutions. Can be no question. They had religion, which they inherited from the mother state, but they said, we are African, or we are Afrikaner. Um, and and I think that there is evidence to suggest that theirs was an opposing group nationalism to the people who they dispossessed throughout Southern Africa, but starting with the Khoi in the 17th century. That's, I think, the way I would put it. But it's a very good point. You have put your finger on.
Well,
what this is about.
would you like to make further comment or? Right. Right. Well, I think we've come to the point, and that we open the discussion to the floor and also to people online. But I see a hand raised there, so.
Hi, I'm Michael Burnett, the son of Andrew. This all of this has actually I'm not very familiar with the content of this book, and I found the question about indigenousness actually particularly interesting. And I just wanted to say, at what point did the Khoi themselves become indigenous in the Cape, and is there a transition between being a new person and then becoming indigenous? Because we look at it as the Dutch dispossessed the Khoi, who were the indigenous, but perhaps did they dispossess somebody else who was indigenous before they got there? That's at what point do you no longer be indigenous?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the questions to me, I think there is evidence, and I'm not an expert, but that the San Bushmen, as they are called sometimes in South Africa, and I apologize if I haven't got the current title, the San were certainly throughout the western part of southwestern Southern Africa. They may have been dispossessed by the Khoi, but I would have to say, Michael, that another historian with more knowledge would have to confirm that. I do know that John Laban's book, The Land Wars, deals directly with that part. The first half of his book deals directly with that point, as does Nigel Penn's book on the violence in the 17th and 18th century on the Cape frontier, which was the VOC frontier. But that's the best way I can answer your question.
Right. Any other questions? Yeah, if you could.
Hi, I'm Renat Kipma. I'm wondering, I mean, at the moment we see many Afrikaners uh, coming to Europe, also to the Holland. And I wonder, how would you reflect on the kinship between the modern Dutch, so we're talking about 2020, and the modern the modern Afrikaner?
That to me is one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I was so fascinated by that issue. From 1994, I witnessed, because I was still resident in Southern Africa until 1999, I witnessed a turning of the heads of the Afrikaner intellectual elite towards Europe. Before that, that was not what a good Afrikaner national intellectual would do, because those people were against what, quote, we stood for, unquote. So that's a very short answer, but I think it is incredibly positive for people in this building, this foundation, to and as a friend of the house, I see the relationship growing, and I think it's a good thing. But it was fascinating to me to watch what the Afrikaner intellectual elite did after, when Mandela became president.
I see another question.
Hi, my name is Jacques. I'm an Afrikaner living in the Netherlands. I've lived in a few other countries around the world. So the concept of being a foreigner or an immigrant in another country is something that I've experienced, and it's something that I've thought about a lot. So the concept of the indigenousness of Afrikaners in South Africa is something that hits quite close to home. In the current political landscape, Afrikaners are often, or non-white or white South Africans are often confronted with the idea of going back where you come from. Now, as an Afrikaner who's spent 5 years in the Netherlands, I can say that I feel very little kinship with your average Dutchman. I think culturally the differences are vast. Religiously, I see no parallels anymore. I think that might have been the case in the past. The closest thing we have in common is the language, and there I find myself laughing at the differences more often than I probably should. So, the idea of having to go back where we're from. My family has been on the continent in South Africa since the 1680s. I have Dutch, French, German, Polish, Irish, English heritage all in my family line. You mentioned Andries Pretorius, for example. He's in my family line, and his mother was from, the stammoeder van Andries Pretorius was from, I think, the east coast of India, for example. So we have, on average, 3, 4, 5% non-West or non-European DNA as well. So I consider myself African and South African and Afrikaner. Unfortunately, I wish the Dutch would offer us passports on arrival. That just doesn't happen. But I think as the situation stands today, we have no other home, and I think it's unfortunate that we need to challenge that today, because the situation, the fact that Africa is not our home, that we are not indigenous there, there's nowhere else where we belong more than we belong there. And even if we look at the bloodlines, for example, we are genetically, on average, only about 36%. Yes, it's the majority of our DNA, but it's not. I think it's a misnomer to describe us as Dutch Africans or Dutch Boer. There's so much more that contributed to our bloodline, but also even the language as well. Afrikaans is, I think, today richer in its vocabulary than what you might expect from a Dutch perspective. And I would hope that we could put to bed the debate that we are not from there, because if we're not from there, it must mean we're from somewhere else. And if you can show me where that other place is, I think I have about 4 million of my kinsmen in the country would love to know where that is, as the situation in the country proves to be very challenging at the moment.
Right. Does anybody wants to respond on that?
I do hope I understood I understand your precarious situation. Uh, as a Afrikaner, South African, maybe I can call you that way. I'm not sure. In the Netherlands, I mean, being from outside the Netherlands in the Netherlands is a difficult position. I'm sure even for African South Africans. What you said about bloodlines and foremothers, etc., it shows that there are in fact know what we call them, Dutch Africans. So that was also a point I wanted to ask Andrew. I mean, and that brings us back to the same point. Yes, the Dutch and also in South Africa, people called themselves Dutch Africans, but that doesn't mean that you have to reproduce that notion. And I think it's a notion which makes a lot of confusion, especially when you also start to tell that those who are called Afrikaners are from the Netherlands, Germany, Huguenots, enslaved, Khoi, you name it, and then still using that notion makes it a bit confusion. So that was in relation to your question, a question to Andrew.
Would you like to respond on that comment?
Title.
Oh, about the title, of course. Sure. Here, I think I am on fairly good ground because I stick with the name that was given by the Dutch kinship leadership to the people they were looking at, they were gazing at, they were viewing, and they were in some ways seeing them as an image of what a good Nederlander should be.
Imagining.
Indeed. Yeah, they were. But they called them Hollandse Afrikanen. It's everywhere in the media and in the resources. And when you today use Lingvanex, for example, to translate into Dutch, it does not know that term. It calls it Nederlandse Afrikanen. But it's Hollandse.
It's the ideological construct I think we're talking about. Yeah.
May I add to that? I have been puzzled by your use of the stamverwantschap movement, especially because this idea and notion and movement as well, the activity, was not only between the Netherlands and South Africa or the Transvaal, but also the Flemish. And they were Catholic in the main. So you define stamverwantschap in terms of religion, history, bloodlines, and so on. But how does it connect to this greater Dutch idea, which is connected to stamverwantschap? And in that respect, also again to the Hollandse.
Sure. Now that is the point you make about the Catholic and what was going on in Flemish area. Yeah. I spent some time looking at the journal Neerlandia, which was the kind of organ of that movement. And I mentioned a couple of times the concept of pan-Dutchness, but to me, I wanted to focus on this particular aspect, which resulted in the NZRV and the very clear focus. But yes, there's no doubt, particularly in the 1890s, that the Dutch intellectuals were deeply involved in a broader idea that Dutchness could be simply on the basis of language and not merely religion. I don't think they would have specifically gone into the idea of other races than European, however. Maybe they would. I don't know the full answer.
No, then and still, I mean, stamverwantschap is a racialized notion, very much so, which is, well, you mentioned it as well in your question. It is really important to reflect on that racialized part of stamverwantschap and also how the Dutch looked at the Afrikaners in South Africa and the other way around. That was crucial. So I was very happy to read about the Venda children, but it seemed a small footnote in your main argument. Well, I liked in that respect also Jacob's question. How do we integrate the racial questions in this movement and in this subject? And I do understand the the problem of finding archives of the people involved. But on the other hand, there are whiteness studies who teach us how to look at archival documents in a different way in order to find these spaces where you can have more attention for the racial element.
Right. Do you want to add something to that, or? Yeah. Well, please, please add.
Yeah, no, two points I think that are interesting here. I think that's also the discussion that was earlier with the title of indigenousness. Huh? These words come from a place of emancipation of particular groups, right? So if this is very maybe too sociological for this, but I always look like where do these concepts come from, and indigenous was like a move from particular groups of people that were marginalized to emancipate themselves, to claim new rights through the UN and various treaties. And what you see then is very interesting, and this is, I mentioned that explicitly in my book on white South Africans, that groups in South Africa claim indigenousness as a move to do away with the history of apartheid, to do away with the history of racial oppression, and to embrace victimhood, right? To embrace marginality, to position themselves as more vulnerable than I think based on socioeconomic position, social position, access to international they are. So what I find fascinating about this, and you sort of tried to get to that point, that indigenous as a concept travels right between these groups and thereby masks and obscures power relationships, right, and positions in society. So I think that's one point, and I think my question about the role of slavery in this whole debate speaks also to that fact. Like, and let me just reflect on the Dutch, which is my topic. So not say so much about the Afrikaners, but I think it's amazing to me to read a person like Abraham Kuyper and his denial, right, of the importance of slavery and what we now know about slavery being present. But to my astonishment, was also very much known during Kuyper's time, right? There were Dutch pastors writing whole books about the position of particular groups, the violence at the frontier, the enslavement of young people, but it was very unclear often the age, and so they stayed slave for they lived under terrible conditions. These slaves themselves were speaking. We now have, a large literature that brings to into. So it's interesting to think about, when we think about the whiteness of the Stamverwantschap movement, right? Sort of this racial aspect of it, that not seeing or denying the importance of slavery was very much part in the Netherlands of the movement, and was very explicit, very very like Kuyper goes to London, right, to have another. You talk about Estancia speech, and then right the same year he goes to London to defend his viewpoint very extensively and on behalf of the Afrikaners, right? He also does the work for them. He's their intellectual man. Yeah. So yeah. I'm not sure if I'm making a question on point.
I think that that was an interesting comment. Are there any questions via the online thing? So I think we have room for one last question. Somebody would like to take that? Because I wanted to have a little question, because we're talking about really interesting things, mainly in context of South Africa, but there's also, of course, a Dutch side to this. I was particularly struck by the Jonkman report or your comments on it, and this VOC hallucination in which Jonkman walks through Cape Town and suddenly sees Jan van Riebeek walking down the street, and then he writes this down as this great experience for him. You connect that with to the term nostalgia, and I think I would like to invite you a little bit to talk a little bit more about nostalgia as a concept, to understand the idea of stamverwantschap, and maybe also to understand the way Dutch colonialism works, because Jonkman didn't have any direct experiences with 17th century Netherlands because he lived in the 19th century. So this nostalgia apparently was was fed by something. Could you share some ideas or give us a hint where we might find like the key towards Dutch colonial nostalgia and maybe also in the present day?
Vincent, that is a very fair question. I believe simplistically, as an outsider, that it feeds on the roots or the stream of what happened to the Dutch in the Napoleonic era, when they were smashed to pieces, their whole system of government. Dutch historians suggest that the state was was just different afterwards. It never recovered. So in that sense, there was a real need for who am I, what is my history, where am I going, for the Dutch intellectual. And that's why I think the nostalgia came. Now, Jonkman, as you say, he was a lecturer, he was a scientific type, not a historian, not a humanitarian. At Utrecht University, and what struck him too about Stellenbosch was that they shared the same motto as his own university. He was in South Africa for a whole year, sent on behalf of the NZRV, and I think he was a liberal, not a neo-Calvinist, and I think he found it a moving experience because, as he said in my chapter on that, he went to places where they sang the same psalms, they sang the same hymns. To him, this was important intellectually. Why he was like that, I think he was simply reflective of many intellectuals in that period. They were looking for this kind of identity, and nostalgia was something which gave it to them. Looking back helped them to find out where they could go. That's my answer. There may be better ones.
Well, I think we leave it to that answer, and I think we end with maybe slightly more questions than we started off with. But I think that's always good in the academic discussion. So I'd really like to thank Andrew, but also the two commentators of today for really profound ideas and thoughts. And I hope, and I'd like to thank all you for your attention and questions as well. I hope you take this home and have further thoughts on this. That's what academia is about, isn't it? Right. Thank you for your attention and hope to see you soon. Bye bye.